séance est ouverte.
Pardon me, can you hear me, Madam Clerk? My mute is off. Okay, very good. I'm going to call this meeting to order. This is the 25th meeting of the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. Today, I'd like to remind colleagues that the meeting is webcast and will be made available on the House of Commons website. This meeting is being called in pursuant to the Standing Order 1064. That a committee meeting be held today to consider the request submitted to the clerk by 4 members of the committee to discuss the motion to request further documentation and testimony in relation to the study concerning questions of conflict of interest in lobbying in relation to the pandemic spending. Now, 1064 effectively just calls the meeting. We will, I'm certain, entertain motions with regards to the specifics if members determine that they would like to move that motion. I think that's how we'll proceed. Today is a date that we would usually have or we had intended to have a business meeting anyway, and so I'm certain that there are other matters of business that we'll entertain. I do already have a speaking list that has started to develop. We'll begin by turning to Mr. Angus. We have Mr. Barrett. I see Madame Shanahan's hand is raised as well. And we'll entertain members as I guess we'll get through all the business that we can in the next couple of hours. Mr. Angus, we'll turn to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. This morning I wanted to speak to 2 issues of points of privilege. I won't be too long, but I think it's important for the committee to consider them. The first is last week when the Kielburger brothers came for their testimony. At the same moment that they launched their testimony, they launched an attack website on me, referring to something like 101 lies I've apparently said. I don't lose much sleep over that. I feel kind of like it was very juvenile. I feel like they were trying to stone me in the public square with popcorn. But what concerns me, and I put this to the committee because the issue of our work is serious. The fact that we had to go a full week before where they were actually undermining, their lawyers were claiming that parliamentarians shouldn't even be able to draw witness testimony. I've not been aware of attack websites on members of parliament before. I think it is very concerning. I think it's something, personally, I've been around a long time. I've got pretty tough shoulders, but I think it could certainly intimidate new MPs, and other groups may consider it. But as part of this first issue of privilege, the same time that this attack website was launched on me, a Twitter doxing campaign was launched against my daughter. Her photograph was posted online. Her place of work was posted online. People began to target her employer about my daughter. I actually tried to engage with some of them because they weren't bots, they were real people, and I was trying to say, why are you making stuff up? But what I realized that it was a deliberate disinformation campaign to intimidate me through my daughter, over the fact that when she was 13 years old, she volunteered for a Free the Children event. I don't know that my daughter's 13-year-old behavior trying to save the world has anything to do with committee. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this. I want the committee to be aware of it because I think it is a pattern of intimidation that when we draw people's family into our work, when people draw our family in, when they try and intimidate us through harassing our family with photos of them, where they work, information, I think it is very, very concerning. And if it happens to me, it could easily happen to any of you. So I wanted to put that out there. I'm not sure where I'm going to go with this, if anywhere. And again, I'd have to talk with my daughter because it's about her personal space that was deliberately invaded because I was asking questions about the Kielburger operation. So, but I want to go now to my second point of privilege, which I think is definitely within the purview of this committee. One of the problems that we've had with the Kielburger study, the WE study in pandemic spending, is after 8 months, and I challenge any of my colleagues to tell me if they actually know how the WE organization works. We don't know anything about their financial structure. We don't know their real estate. We don't know how the donor issues work. We've been sort of trying to get answers, and it's about the due diligence that we have to do in order to finalize our report. I'm pretty close to being ready to finalize this report, but one of those questions was to have Mr. Victor Lee testify. We had to issue a legal summons against Mr. Victor Lee. Mr. Victor Lee said he couldn't come, and he asked us to go the extra mile and let him write, that we would write questions and he would answer those questions. Mr. Victor Lee has opted not to answer a number of questions, and I think my privilege and the privilege of this committee has been undermined by the trust that we gave Mr. Victor Lee, because these are key questions. I'm going to run through just a few of them, and I'm going to ask my colleagues to consider.
Mr. Angus, I do apologize for interrupting. Apparently, we are experiencing technical difficulties right now. There's some technical challenges. We're being asked to suspend. Madam Clerk, can you just confirm that we can just stay on, but just suspend for a period of time?
Correct.
Okay, we will suspend, colleagues. I do apologize. We'll hopefully be back up and running as soon as they've got us back on parallel view. Meeting suspended.
Good to go, Mr. Chair.
Colleagues, we're going to call this meeting back to order. I do apologize. Mr. Angus, we'll turn back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to raise an issue of privilege relating to our work and our ability to get answers on the issue of the We Charity scandal. I won't take too much time, but I think it's very concerning, because part of the role that we had to do in terms of finalizing this study was that after 8 months, none of us around this committee actually have any real sense of how the Kielburger operation works. We know of We Charity. We know that there's a multitude of side companies, but we don't really have a sense. So when questions were being raised, we cannot say we've actually done the due diligence. This was why we agreed to have Mr. Victor Lee testify. We've attempted for a number of months to have Mr. Victor Lee. We issued a legal summons for Mr. Victor Lee. He said he was feeling sick, and I think we were all very reasonable and did something that I've never heard of being done before, offering to let him answer questions in writing. What concerns me, and the reason I'm bringing it forward, is that a number of questions that were asked were not answered. And I can only see that that decision not to answer key questions was deliberate, and I would suggest that that's an infringement on the work of our committee. I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of them are key. What compensation, financial or otherwise, have you received from any of the related corporate companies or real estate? What other We-related, Kielburger-related entities are you involved with in a capacity as a director or CFO? We have been informed that staff at Free the Children, We Charity, were paid through Me to We, the for-profit arm. How many employees were paid through the for-profit wing while working for the charity? Do the founders have signing authority at We Charity and or any other We organizations? How many organizations, corporations, charities, etc. are in the global We family? Please list them and where they are registered. He refused to answer that. How many of these companies, organizations are owned partially or entirely by We founders Craig and Mark Kielburger or Roxanne Joyal? He refused to answer that. Does We Charity, Me to We, or any subsidiary organizations do any business with companies owned by the founders or their family members, and this includes from rent on property, purchase of goods and services? Refused to answer that. What financial systems do you use to track and account for any donations coming into the Kielburger-related organization? How far do these records go? He refused to answer that. We're dealing with a charity, and we're asking questions about donor tracking. What systems and structures do you have in place to ensure the designated funding is actually spent in the appropriate places? He did not answer that. Please provide a list of all schools, along with the country, addresses, location, and what donor funds went into its construction. He did not answer that. That should have been one of the easiest questions to answer, because we were told about all the good work they're doing with children. This is an opportunity for them to explain exactly where the donor funds have gone and what they built. Please indicate any schools that we built for any other foundations. We know that they've been involved, so what have they done? How many hospitals has We Charity Free the Children built in the past 25 years? Please provide a list of all hospitals, along with the country, addresses, location, and what donor funds went into its construction. He did not answer that. How many villages were adopted in the last 25 years? He did not answer that. We asked about the property that they own. And the reason these questions are important is because we were told last week, time and time again, by the Kielburger brothers about the incredible good work that they've done on behalf of children around the world. And this was an opportunity for them to clear the record, particularly in light of the very, very concerning allegations raised by Bloomberg, by Fifth Estate, by other journalists. So, Mr. Chair, I feel that my rights as a member have been impeded by the fact that Mr. Victor Lee was given a legal summons. We agreed to let him answer in writing, and he has not answered key questions about the financial structure and operations of this organization. I would like to turn it over to the committee. I think that this is a serious issue. I think it is a prima facie case of contempt. The question is do we give him a period of time to answer those questions? What should we do? But I think this is not just about me. This is about the work of our committee.
Okay, with regards to the discussion on the motion or the question before the committee, I'll turn to members that have indicated their hands are raised. Madame Shanahan, your hand was raised before this issue was brought up. Did you want to get on the speaking list with regards to this question as well? Okay, Madame Shanahan, we'll turn to you first.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to extend to Mr. Angus my just the how appalled I am that his daughter has experienced this attack on her. And I think we've had this discussion before in this committee, how attack on family members of parliamentarians is odious. And in this light, particularly if it seeks to intimidate or to shut down a parliamentary member, this I cannot be allowed to go unchecked. And I wonder, I just wonder if the member, of course, will seek whatever security and legal means that he needs to do. But if the chair if we can explore our options, because I think of, especially in social media, I think of the attacks that have proliferated in the last few years on members of parliament and by extension to family members. I think we agree that an attack on a family member is essentially an attack on the member of parliament too, and therefore a question of privilege. And so I would like to see that we can explore our options. I do want to address the motion before us as well, Chair. Unfortunately, the motion that we are here to discuss today, it to me is nothing but a fishing expedition by the opposition, and testimony on this issue, where I think that we have shown on the Liberal side that we have been very collaborative in bringing forward.
Madame Shanahan, I don't want to interrupt. I'm reluctant to, but I will interrupt. I just want to verify that right now we are discussing the matter of privilege that Mr. Angus brought forward with regards to the lead documents. Nobody has actually moved a motion with regards to the 1046 request for the meeting. I'm certain that will happen in due course, but I think that it would be helpful for members if we debated these in order. And so I'd like to get committees the sense of where a committee is with regards to the point of privilege that was brought forward first by Mr. Angus.
Understood. So then on the second point of privilege regarding Victor Lee, again, I think that this is where we have shown our collaboration and certainly our agreement that witnesses, we can have our discussions about which witnesses we want to see in front of this committee, but once a witness is summoned, that is the wish of the committee. Chair, you have shown great flexibility in accommodating witnesses, but I think that I agree with Mr. Angus that this is something that we need to pursue. Perhaps because we know there's health issues involved, perhaps a letter from the chair giving the Mr. Lee an opportunity to respond again to the questions that were asked, because that is what has been found deficient. Perhaps that would be a way forward. Thank you. And then I do want to speak again.
Right. Yeah. We'll note that you were on the speaking list early as well with regards to the other issues. We'll turn to Mr. Erskine Smith. Colleagues, again, we're debating the issue of the point of privilege with regards to the Lee documents. Mr. Erskine Smith.
So very simply, I would just say, I think Charlie raises a really important point, not only with respect to his daughter. That is just unconscionable to people online who are highlighting the work of his daughter, suggesting there are some sort of conflict of interest there. All of the allegations and the work online around Charlie's daughter is just so unconscionable and should be condemned by all of us. The second piece, though, in relation to privilege as it relates to Victor Lee, I do think, just as a matter of us crossing our T's and dotting our I's, I think we should, Chair, you should write a letter to Victor Lee and his counsel, set a specific timeline for these answers to be provided. And once that timeline has elapsed, whatever answers have been provided, if no answers have been provided, that makes our job a little easier. But whatever answers have been provided, we can then reconvene a meeting specific to considering those answers and considering this question of privilege, and to determine whether the answers are sufficient or whether they're still lacking in some fashion and have shown contempt in some way. And I would suggest 5 days from the date that your letter is sent, some short timeline. But I think we do want to make sure that we are affording as much. We want to act as reasonably as we can when we're undertaking something as serious, potentially, as referring a matter for contempt, which is where this would ultimately lead.
Thank you. We'll turn to Mr. Silvera.
Good morning, everyone. Just on chatting with discussing Charlie's points this morning that are raised. On the first one, I'm just, to Deputy Angus, and I want to address you formally on that one. On this one, yeah, I saw the tweets and read the tweets that were directed at your daughter and stuff, and I am vehemently, completely appalled into the strongest language without using foul language that would happen to anyone's daughter. I have 2 daughters. I plan to continue being an MP as long as the voters give me that privilege and that confidence. And my daughters are growing up, and one of them will hit 10 years old, so not too far, a few years younger than Charlie's daughters, and they will have experiences with volunteer work and with employment. And I would absolutely be disgusted if some organization, not saying that it was an organization, but just in the circumstance that it was an organization or individuals potentially coordinated to attack me, and then with that attack my daughters. So I don't know what can be done. I would love to get clarification from the clerk on that in terms of what can we do or can't do. That'd be great. On the second one, on the second point of privilege, which is in reference to the documents requested, my understanding in reading the rules and procedures with regards to parliamentary committees that are formed by the House of Commons and the elected individuals, we have certain responsibilities, but we have certain powers to obtain documents when we are doing a study. And I'm with my colleague Nathaniel. We have asked for these questions. We have asked for these documents. They do need to be provided. I think it is that is imperative. A committee cannot undertake a study without receiving the information they need to finish that study. So I am of the mind that a further 5 days or whatever pertinent period be provided, that a response can be done before the next steps are then decided upon by the committee. The committee is the master of its own direction and domain. So I'm with Charlie and with Nathaniel on their view there. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We'll turn to Mr. Fortin, followed by Mr. Angus, and then Mr. Carey. Mr. Fortin, we'll turn to you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Well,
On the 2 points brought up by our good colleague, Mr. Angus, of course, I fully agree with him. This is totally unacceptable. Having our families being threatened or intimidated in such a way. I think that, very unfortunately, the committee may not be able to do all that much about it, but I am quite convinced the police officers would be happy to receive information about this, and I stand at his side in this matter. It's totally unacceptable that the families of parliamentary officers be threatened. So that's for the first issue. On the second issue of privilege, I agree about this, Mr. Lee's responses. I haven't perhaps looked through them in great detail, but I have already found fault and the point that he's not answering the committee's questions well. It's as though he hasn't turned up to be heard by the committee, basically. So what I suggest as an approach is that we write to him, that the chair write to him in our name to advise him that the committee finds that his silence is an infringement of his rights and a contempt, really, a contempt of Parliament. And that we give him one last chance to respond to us, perhaps giving him the list of questions again and setting a timeline for receiving his answers, and that unless we receive the answers to each of the questions by the end of the time period set, the committee will report to the House of Commons, and the House of Commons will decide how to follow up. But to my mind, it's really an equivalent of not appearing after being summoned. So those are my 2 comments, Chair. I would also like to point out that I hope we'll have time to study the motion that has drawn us together here this morning, of course. And for our part at the Bloc Québécois, we recommend the production of the report. We think it's an important matter. We could certainly, just mentioned, address this earlier, but this also is in line with what Mr. Angus is asking about Mr. Lee's testimony. We really do need to shed light on this. This is a good deal of money that was to be paid to We Charity to manage about $1 million, and we certainly should know what the government was about to spend our money on. So I would like to ensure that we really deal very directly with Mr. Lee, not just a nice invitation to please turn up and answer things, but a requirement that he be compelled to respond to the questions, and that if he doesn't, this will be in contempt of Parliament, and that we will refer this to the House of Commons within 5 days of the end date if we haven't his answer by then. Thank you, Chair.
You will go to Mr. Angus now and then Mr. Carey to follow. Mr. Angus.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank all my colleagues for your solidarity. I actually find it really hard to even raise this issue because I like to think that I live in a world where I can defend myself and be myself, and people, it's a tough world in politics, and I don't mind the bricks and brats, but to even have to mention that my family's been dragged into it has been something I did not want to do, but I think it's important that we're aware of it. And I recognize that my colleagues from all parties carry themselves with dignity on these issues and would not support these kind of side attacks, but they are something that we need to consider. So I don't think I will take it as an issue of privilege to the House. But I wanted people to be aware of it because I think we have to start seeing the kind of pressures that are being put on us at times for issues that we raise. I appreciate my colleagues also on the second point. I have to say I'm just getting rather frustrated with this sense of entitlement that we've seen from an organization that seems to think we're picking on them. It's about getting answers. We just need to get answers. We need to finish this report. We need to do due diligence. This is our work. This is our right as parliamentarians. Questions about finances of an organization are absolutely fair questions to ask, and I think we've gone out of our way to do this in a fair way. To Mr. Erskine-Smith's point, and I think it is really important that we cross all the T's and dot all the I's. This committee has certain powers, but it has to exercise those powers within a context of making sure that we follow the rules that are given to us as parliamentarians. I'm very frustrated that I didn't get answers, that we've gone out of our way, but I think that this next step of saying, I think 5 days is more than enough. We want those answers. If we're not getting those answers, then I refer it to the House. I mean, we need to move on with this report. If we're going to, we don't have time to play games when it's about the work and the right of parliamentarians to get answers. So I would support my colleagues who say, let's do this right. Let's ask him one more time that we've got 5 days, and if not, then we'll refer this to the House. So I'm more than willing to accept the suggestions made by my colleagues. Thank you.
Very good. Mr. Carey, I think you're the last person to intervene with, or that has indicated a desire to intervene on this, Mr. Carey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and colleagues. I want to thank you, Mr. Angus. I think any action by witnesses that could be perceived as intimidation of a committee member is extremely serious. And the fact that they involved, or the consequences involved, your daughter, I think all of us see how that would affect us personally and how we do our jobs here at committee. So I think this is extremely serious, and for you to bring it up so we can address it is very important, and thank you for that. As far as the second point with Mr. Lee, I agree with Charlie. Trying to figure out how this charity works in relations to their for-profit arm. I know during my questioning, I was deliberately trying to get answers about the separation from We Charity and the for-profit arm, and it seemed to be a deliberate attempt consistently to move things back to the charity. For example, when I talked about their sponsors of the We Day event, which is a for-profit event, they kept on saying our donors are extremely generous, but it's so confusing. I think some of their donors don't even realize, or I should say contributors, because if it wasn't a donation to a charity, they certainly weren't donating to We to build schools and help kids in Kenya. But this was a promotion and public relations event, and some of their sponsors were giving money, and they may have actually thought that they were giving to a charity when it was a for-profit event. So I think we do have to dig a little deeper to find out how these organizations work. And it's extremely important for us, as far as making this report moving forward, that everyone can understand that there is a distinguishing difference between a charity and a for-profit event and where the money goes.
Okay, I think that there's a consensus that I certainly have seen, and I think if it's if committee members are amenable to it, we will simply move to write the letter, give Mr. Lee up until Friday to answer the question, but we will require the assistance of committee members, those committee members who have submitted questions that don't believe that they have been answered. We will need you to indicate to us that those questions need to be answered so that we can include those in the letter. We want to be very specific about the questions that we do not believe have been answered. Mr. Angus has given his list. That may not be an exhaustive list. So members, if you could get that to committee members, pardon me, to the analyst, to the clerk, let's send it to the clerk by the end of today. Those questions that have not been answered, then the letter can be produced and we can get that off and get that sent off. So I think that's settled. Mr. Angus, with regards to your daughter, I think you have, I believe that any intimidation of members, especially when it involves a family member, would be seen by this chair as an issue of privilege. And certainly if you desire at some point to bring that forward, to ask committee members. Obviously, you have the back of every committee member that spoke thus far, and this chair, of course, would pursue that not only on behalf of committee but as a father as well. Next, we're going to go to the speaking order. I do have Mr. Barrett, Miss Shanahan, and then Mr. Fortin has indicated that he'd like to move the motion. I'm not sure if we'd like to do this in reverse order, if it would be helpful. Madame Shanahan, we'll turn to you, but it seemed like you were looking to debate the motion that Mr. Fortin is about. So I think maybe it would be more productive if we actually had the motion moved by Mr. Fortin, and then we can begin the debate on that. I think that may be more productive.
Agree,
so
Chair.
Okay,
you can move
good.
me to after Mr. Fortin, Mr. Barrett. Thank you.
Sure thing. Okay, I think what we'll do is we'll move to Mr. Fortin, and if he wants to move the motion that this meeting was called with regards to, then we could begin the debate with regards to that. Mr. Fortin.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, look, I won't just be reading it through word for word. We've all read the motion, and it speaks for itself, I think. But in substance, what it says is that we have been inquiring into the We Charity issue since this summer. That said, as of a number of months, we've been trying to shed light on this government undertaking, which was to pay a charity $43 million to distribute 900 and some million dollars to student services, to grants. And we know that we have heard from the Finance Committee, from Trudeau, we've heard a number of witnesses, actually. But the key of the matter, the heart of the matter, remains understanding what our government based its decisions on, both ethically and financially, to be placing our RSPs. And, you don't turn that sort of thing over to the first person who turns up on the street. You want to know if you're going to give your RSP to a bank, a trust, or, who do you give your money to when you want to invest? That's the basic issue. So we would expect some sort of due diligence carried out in that would respect the amount being invested. If I go to a bank and I am putting in an RSP of $2,000, well, my due diligence will be pretty simple. I know the bank, I've worked with the bank, I've met the bank organizers, and I've signed my documents, and I've read the documents. So that is due diligence for that sum of money. But if I'm the Prime Minister of Canada and I'm turning over $43 million to an organization, my due diligence is a little more tightly defined. And I think that in a matter such as this, there necessarily should have been due diligence carried out from the outset. We've been saying, well, it was a bit unusual as a situation. There was no call for tenders. And the analysts who've come to tell us so far that if you don't approach things this way, that is the normal way to proceed, then you have an even greater requirement to ensure that due diligence is carried out before you turn a contract over to any specific service provider. So what did the Prime Minister do? There was no call for tenders. Yes, we can understand. We're in a pandemic. Things are moving quickly. But if they were unable to proceed that way, what did they do? We put this question to Mr. Schockert in August of last at the Finance Committee, and he told us that, yes, there had been due diligence. And I undertake, in fact, I have provided the text of our interventions there. It's very clear that when we said, yes, we want the contribution agreement, we were told, yes, but it was the due diligence that Ms. Boudreau requested. But I'm not sure the witness understood us and answered, I did understand, Chair, and I undertook to provide both the report of due diligence and the contribution agreement. Now, the contribution agreement, we got it, but the due diligence report, we never did get that. So at this point, Chair, we're still unable to know what type of check, what type of due diligence was carried out by the government before investing our $43 million. And what we learned as questions were put and inquiry was deepened was that contrary to what the cabinet members believed, it wasn't really in We Charity that the funds were invested. We Charity being a well-known entity, but in a new sort of corporation that was created specifically to receive this investment. And when I put the question to the brothers Kielberger, they told us, well, it's normal that we created this new corporation because our attorney told us to do so to protect the assets in We Charity. And I'm wondering, good heavens, what's that about? Our government wasn't investing $43, but $43 million of our dollars in an empty sort of corporate entity without any financial history, without, I think, any due diligence carried out. So, of course, I'm worried. Now I'm hearing that the audit report exists. So I find all this very doubtful, Chair. We certainly need the audit report to be able to see clearly what was done, what type of due diligence was carried out. Now, of course, there's all the conflict of interest issues. We mustn't spend all day going through that with a fine-tooth comb, but certainly on the due diligence report, we certainly have a right to know what allowed the government to feel so comfortable making such a big investment. Another matter about the witnesses. Perhaps my colleagues can speak to this issue, but I certainly will agree that we saw questions and answers of last week with Mr. Poilievre underscoring, well, not an email, but, well, it was a communication of some sort, in which Mr. Kielberg had been thanking Mr. Chin for his assistance and saying, yes, I've sent many communications of this nature. I've thanked so many people. Well, I suppose so many people that didn't really need to be thanked. Look, I find this kind of doubtful. It's not really a very good explanation, is it? If I were speaking for the attorney and Mr. Kielberger were my client, we would have talked this through thoroughly, because I don't think that sort of thing is very credible. So I think we need to hear these people in order to really understand what's gone on. And I could go on further if necessary, but I think that is about it for the motion for now. Thank you, Chair.
Ms. Shanahan first on the speaking list.
Chair, I would like to go after Mr. Barrett, given that it's his motion as well. I'd like to hear what he has to say. So you can put me afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, we are debating Mr. Fortin's motion, but if Mr. Barrett would like to jump in, we'll allow Mr. Barrett to do that now. Mr. Barrett.
Well, thanks very much, Chair, and appreciate the comments by Mr. Fortin. The question of the diligence, the due diligence that was done in the preparation of the presenting this proposal to Cabinet is really key, and certainly with the revelations that we've heard in recent weeks and over the last couple of months with respect to and here at this committee with respect to allegations of donor fraud and double matching and the like, what the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister and members of Cabinet knew, and when they knew it, is key to understanding if, and I think would really go a long way with respect to answering the question and restoring the or reassuring Canadians that proper processes were followed. And it's unusual that the ask was made and for this report, and it was, the response was that, we'll provide that, and then it wasn't provided. That is unusual. So I think that when you look further in some of the questions that we asked of Mr. Lee, that would hopefully, the answers would hopefully clarify some of the structure and how the WE organization is arranged. We're left with still a ton of questions, and so if those answers aren't, haven't been forthcoming to this point from the organization, from the partner organization, were they asked originally by PCO, by the government, by a minister, by the public service, before they embarked on a $500 million arrangement with this organization, or were they prepared to ask an unknown to administer a $500 million of taxpayer money and just hope that everything would be okay? Meanwhile, we had a host of other organizations who weren't asked to participate in the CSSG from the charitable sector, but who have since expressed that not only do they think that they would have been able to do it, that they think that they were well equipped, or Canadians would have been best served by them having administered it. So I think that I think that the question that we have in front of us is absolutely germane. And look, it's been many, many months that the government has had to prepare this report. And we expect that it likely is, as Mr. Fortin has heard, he mentioned, that perhaps it already exists. And if that's the case, it should be quite straightforward for the committee to be furnished with this information. With respect to the witnesses, I think that an invitation for those witnesses to appear, we can have a panel of of two witnesses and break them up that way. It doesn't need to be a large production. We're going to ask questions that again are germane to the study, questions that we have this inconsistency with respect to the testimony that has been offered both by senior members of the political offices of members who have, and ministers and the Prime Minister who have testified. And it differs from the testimony from the Kielburgers. So we want to hear directly from these senior staff, get the answers, and put this to bed. I think that that's the biggest takeaway that we had from the testimony from the Kielburgers last week. So let's get to it. Let's hear that testimony as well. And I think that should they make themselves available relatively soon, by the end of next week, we'll have we would have the report, the due diligence report. We would have this requested witness testimony, and then we can start. Hopefully, we'll have the answers from Mr. Lee that the committee is going to put to him through the chair, from a letter from the chair. And by the end of next week, we could be giving instructions to the analysts with respect to preparing our report. And that's where we need to get. The committee has a number of other things on that are pending, and so let's just get to let's get to wrapping this up, answering those unanswered questions, receiving the documents that were promised but have not been received, and getting the final set of questions from Mr. Lee, which I appreciate speaks to the previous question that was raised by Mr. Angus. So I think that once we have that information set, those three items, then we'll be in a good position to finally, many months after we first embarked on this journey, be prepared to give instructions to the analysts and report this to the House. So thanks, Chair.
Okay, I've got a developing speakers list here. We have Madame Shanahan first, and then we'll follow that by Mr. Angus, Mr. Erskine Smith, and then Mr. Dong. Madame Shanahan, we'll turn to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. And yes, I'm glad that I'm able to speak at this point now, because in the course of the discussion to date in this meeting, we can see the difference between substantive testimony that is helpful to this committee's work, and what amounts to a fishing expedition. And on the substantive testimony, that is why I am certainly in agreement, and I know in discussing with my colleagues, we take this work very seriously. We can have differences about what witnesses we want to hear and when we want to hear them and so on. But once this committee makes a decision, we are very supportive on this side in going after the testimony that is critical to producing what will ultimately be our report and our recommendations on this pandemic study. But it seems that the motion before us, the only issue in asking for Mr. Chin has to do with this one-line response through LinkedIn that was in response to an unsolicited invite to be a contact with Mr. Kielburger. I seem to remember this coming out last summer in the document dump. I don't like that word. Documents should be treated carefully, but when that number are asked for, and I know that they were gone through very carefully, that seems to be the only thing that came out from that production of documents. In fact, there was a press conference about this LinkedIn communication. I guess that's good for LinkedIn's business, but it really didn't seem to go anywhere. And that, that's from last summer. And as far as the due diligence report goes, we all know that Mr. Shugart is undergoing cancer treatments right now. And first of all, let me just say something about the characterization in the motion of the Liberal government's Privy Council. I take great exception to that characterization, to that smear on the good work of nonpartisan work of public servants in the Privy Council, including that of Mr. Shugart, who we know by his reputation, by his experience, that he has been an exemplar of nonpartisan professional service to Canada. And so I take great exception to that. The Privy Council works on behalf of all Canadians in executing the work of the government that the Canadians have elected. And so when Mr. Shugart gives us his word that he will produce a document, I think we should take him at that word, knowing that he's in a health situation right now, that he's undergoing treatment. I think that this committee can show the same kind of flexibility that we have shown to other witnesses. And indeed, where I will agree with my colleagues is that we have much more important work to do and to continue taking up valuable committee time on calling witnesses on a fishing expedition in pursuing this study. Thank you.
We'll turn to Mr. Angus. Mr. Angus.
Well, thank you, and thank you to my colleague for this motion. I'm certainly interested in it if there's a due diligence report. I don't have a problem looking at it. The issue of due diligence is something that's been important from the get-go. As for Mr. Shugart, he is off. He is, I believe, taking medical treatments, and I don't think it's fair to ask him to come back. Mr. Shugart did testify last summer. He testified for a good period of time. I was at those hearings. I don't believe Mr. Shugart would give us anything different if we asked him now than what he gave us then. I don't believe there's anyone else at Privy Council who stepped in to replace him who would be helpful, because it was under Mr. Shugart's watch. So if there's an issue of a due diligence report, I'd say let's just add it to the list. I hope we can get these things settled, my friends, because we know that the Liberals are going to be bringing Bill C-11, which will upend all our other work. That's going to be coming soon. We have to finish the Pornhub study. There's a lot of people watching that. We have agreed to the facial recognition study, which I think we need to get to. And I'm really, really adamant that we have to get this report to Parliament. We've been on this for a long time. If there's other documents that could add to it, I think it's time that we actually moved on it. So as much as I appreciate Mr. Fortin's intervention, I don't see that this is an emergency issue that suddenly came up out of nowhere, because it's testimony from 8-9 months ago. So if there's a report, I'll take it, but I'm not interested in having Mr. Shugart come at this time.
Mr. Erskine-Smith, you are a visitor at our committee today. You're not subbed in, but I'll welcome your intervention at this point, but we'll extend that courtesy to you.
Thanks very much. I'll be brief, only to say I agree with everything that my colleague Brenda has said. I agree with Charlie as well. And in the interest of sort of fairness, the one item that came up in relation to the LinkedIn correspondence, I took from previous correspondence back to August that that was the only correspondences between Mr. Chin and the Kilburgers. But I think I don't think my colleagues will support, on the Liberal side, will support this motion. But I think in the interest of fairness, Chair, if you write to Mr. Chin and confirm and have him confirm that that was the only correspondence, it would be odd for us to invite him before this committee if that was in fact the only correspondence. If it's not, if he comes back and says, no, we had I correspond in this way and that way, then I think here, just one sec. Then I think, in fairness, maybe the committee wants to reconsider the question. But based on what we know today, if that was in fact the only correspondence to be confirmed by you potentially, Mr. Chair, I mean, it would be Brenda, I think, is putting it politely to call it a fishing expedition. There would be no merit whatsoever. So that's all I have to say on that. But that would be my one suggestion of sort of maybe a possible consensus way forward.
Thank you for the suggestion. Mr. Dong, we'll turn to you.
Thank you, Chair. This is my first chance to talk about what I'm hearing so far. First of all, to Mr. Angus' point, I want to say to the committee, I agree with writing and requesting document and have it responding in 5 days. And I am concerned also when family members are brought into sort of the extension of our work. It's not a good thing for democracy. We should be able to speak and ask questions freely at the committee, not to think about consequences that what might happen to our family member. So he has my support. I agree with MP Erskine Smith's point that let's write to the individuals that we have interest in. I don't think these are new revelation. I agree with MP Barrett's point that it's been happening for month and month, and I feel like we're just going in circles. If we keep calling people in, and then if we hear something that we want to do more study or bring more people in, we don't hear something, we think that they're not telling the full story. I just feel like we've been going in circles, and let's write the letter, request the information we need, and move on to finalize the report. And that's where I stand right now. Thank you, Chair.
Ms. Shanahan, your hand is raised again on this. Okay, Ms. Shanahan, we'll turn to you.
Yes, Chair. I think we have heard from all the parties now, and so I move that we vote on the motion before us.
Yeah, we don't have anybody else on the speaking list at this point, so we'll move. I think Monsieur Fortin has indicated that he'd like to speak. Monsieur Fortin.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Chair, thank you. I would simply like to add, regarding Mr. Schugert's state of health, while I'm fully aware of this, we're aware of this. You will see, reading the motion, that what we request is that Mr. Schugert or someone else able to represent him make themselves available to file the report. That said, we could receive the report without any witness appearing to produce it. I would consent to that. What counts, though, is receiving the report so that we can develop a clear idea of what was done before this contract was given to eCharity. Thank you, Chair.
Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett.
Yeah, Chair. So in response to Mr. Fortin's comments, I would move an amendment to his motion, and for brevity, because I know this is it's going to need, everyone's going to need to update the copy in front of them.
Chair, point of order.
Madame Shanahan.
Point of order. I did request the vote. I did move that we go to the vote.
As you know, Madame Shanahan, that as long as somebody's on the speaking list, there is no way for a member to force a vote. You do know that from previous experience, and you're now a seasoned parliamentarian, having involved yourself in extended debates in the past. Mr. Barrett, will turn to you.
Yeah, Chair. So I would strike the paragraph calling for or the reference calling for testimony or an appearance by a representative from PCO. Obviously, with Mr. Schugert away from the office, and of course wishing him good health and good results, and when he's ready, a return to his duties. But that said, to receive the report and not require someone to come and present it to us. Of course, should the committee have questions about it, there can be a discussion following receipt of the report whether or not anyone needs to testify. So the motion sponsor, Mr. Fortin, suggested that he would be amenable to this, and so that's the amendment that I'd like to propose.
Monsieur Fortin.
J'accepte.
I accept this proposed amendment, Chair. I agree.
We have Madame Latanzio on the speaking list. Madame Latanzio and then Mr. Sabera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So can we have the motion amended and sent to us in both official languages so that we can take cognizance of this latest amendment before we vote on it? And am I to understand that if we receive the report, that committee members would be satisfied with just the reception? Or are we going to be then having questions, and then depending on the questions of the members, envisage having to subpoena more people to come to the committee and ask more questions? And so I just want to have a direction and understand from both Mr. Barrett and Mr. Fortin as to where this amendment will go. So I'd like to have a clarification on that point, and at the same time also receive both the amendment in both official languages. Thank you.
Okay. It may be helpful. The debate now is on the amendment. If it is possible, we could suspend for a minute or two just to see if that could be circulated. I don't know. We'll suspend for just a few moments, and as soon as it's circulated, we'll call the meeting back to order. Meeting suspended. going back to Madame Latanzio, you now have the text in front of you. Did you have were you done with your intervention, or did you have additional comments you'd like to make?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to have clarification from either Mr. Barrett or Mr. Fortin as to once we get this report, if the committee so wishes to vote for this amendment, will that satisfy the committee members, or are we then to again engage in further, if we have any other questions and subpoenaing other witnesses and go on? Or am I to understand that once we get the report, then that will be it? The committee members will be satisfied. I need to have that answer, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Mr. Sabera next on the speaking list, followed by Mr. Carey and Monsieur Fortin. Mr. Sabera, we'll turn to you.
Thank you, Chair. Excuse me. Thanks for everybody's work on this and getting to a point where we need to get to move on to C11, and actually to be very blunt, to move back to the Pornhub MindGeek study that we are doing. That is receiving a lot of attention from Canadians, a lot of attention from a lot of concerned Canadians, and I think it behooves us to as quickly as possibly and prudently or expeditiously as possible to get back to those matters that are very urgent matter to my constituents and to yours as well. With this motion that's been put forward this morning, I would like to add a sub-amendment to this motion, or move a sub-amendment if I want to make sure I'm speaking on proper terms. So I'm going to ask clerk that the following be inserted and that the following be struck. In terms of the material, I would like to see struck that in the where it says, and that in light of revelations stemming from Craig and Mark Kilberger's testimony of March 15th, 2021, the committee do call for Ben Chin, Rick Tice, Amit Paul Singh to appear before the committee at a date and time determined by the chair, but no later than 1 week following the adoption of this motion. I would like to have in place where that is that and that the clerk write to Mr. Chin, Mr. Ben Chin, and ask him to provide in writing that the only communications he had with the Kilbergers was the already public LinkedIn communication, and the clerk write to Mr. Shugart to determine when the document he agreed to provide to the committee will be forthcoming.
Thank you, Mr. Sabera. We'll get that in writing and distributed to committee members. I just wanted clarification. Was it the clerk that you were seeking to have right, or was it the chair that you'd like to have right?
The chair, through you, chair, of course, in all due respect, of course.
No, that's very good. I just wanted to, I assume that's what we were talking about, but we will suspend the meeting now and do the same thing over again. Mr. Sabera, if you could get that text to the clerk, that would be very helpful. And then we can debate the sub-amendment.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Fergus. Yeah, point of order.
I was just about to send a text over to the chair, to the clerk. I don't think my name was included on the last distribution list. If she could, it might have been just a simple error because I was away from the first part of the meeting. If she could just make sure that she includes my email address.
Perfect. Thanks, Mr. Fergus. We'll make sure that gets added. We will suspend, and when it's distributed, would you get that in your email box? Then we will call the meeting back to order.
Mr. Chair, could you ask that my address be added as well? I didn't receive it either. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, we will do that as well. Meeting suspended, colleagues. get your email as soon as possible. Calling the meeting back to order. We'll now debate on the sub-amendment. We'll go to Mr. Carey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm just reading it right now. Okay. And the clerk right too. First thing about the sub-amendment, writing to Mr. Sugart to determine when the document he agreed to provide would be forthcoming. I don't necessarily see that as relevant. We do want that document, period. So I think we should just be asking for it. And having Mr. Chin in the original ask, there were 3 individuals that were asked to come and testify in front of committee. And I would say, Mr. Chair, that there's more than one way to correspond. There may be that one LinkedIn that was available, but there are text messages, there are phone calls, and I think it's really important that we hear from the people also surrounding Mr. Chin and those people in power that may have had influence in this case. So the sub-amendment here, I don't think really in the spirit of what originally was written would provide the committee with what we would need to have.
Mr. Angus.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess my concern is I find that the wording of this is presupposing an outcome already. That it says that the only communications he had with the Kielburgers was the already public LinkedIn communication. We don't know if that was the only communication, so I think it's problematic. And I agree with my colleague also that the clerk write to Mr. Sugart to determine Mr. Sugart is off, so we don't want to be writing to Mr. Sugart. We want that document. So, but what we haven't discussed is the motion to have Mr. Ben Chin or Rick Tice, or Ben Chin we've talked about, but Rick Tice or Mr. Singh appear. I'm not sure why we're asking them at this point, but it is in the motion. So if we're going to ask them, I would like to have reason to ask them. If my Liberal colleagues want to exclude them, I'd like to have reason to exclude them. But we haven't actually discussed those other two. Mr. Ben Chin appears to us because of the testimony from last week with Mr. Craig Kielburger. I have read many times the 5,000 pages of documents. I think there's a pretty clear pattern of how this deal developed. I think what was struck me about the LinkedIn message and the response that we heard in the testimonies, I didn't find Mr. Kielburger's testimony credible. There may be other reasons that he contacted Mr. Ben Chin to sort of give him the big thumbs up that they'd been awarded the contract. It might have been a case of him trying to, procure further favors in the Prime Minister's office further down the road. But I didn't think Craig Kielburger's response was credible, which is why Mr. Chin's name has been brought forward. But we haven't had a discussion on Mr. Rick Tice, whether he needs to appear. Mr. Singh is in the documents, I think April 20th meeting with Sophia Marquez, but I don't know what he offers to change what we already have in the documents. So I have a problem with the sub-amendment because it precludes the possibility that Mr. Chin may have had other conversations, so that's problematic. It asks Mr. Sugart, who's not in a position to turn over those documents when we need those documents, and I'm still not sure where we're standing with the Mr. Tice and Mr. Singh.
Monsieur Fortin, we'll turn to you.
Yes. Well, I had put my hand up for the prior issue, but okay, on the amendment, I do understand the suggestion being made by our good colleague in this regard. But I think that, look, what's being suggested here really shifts the original text quite a lot. It's not just a matter of having a document brought to us or having a witness to do so. It's just a matter of having one of the names kept of the three and then asking them, in any case, it's a rather suggestive question, asking them to confirm that there was no further discussion beyond the one that we're pointing at. Look, well, you know, that looks a little simplistic, doesn't it? Well, not simplistic in a negative sense, but really just that it might be a little too constrained, too simple. We won't be able to really reach where we're trying to get. So I would have trouble backing this.
Speakers on the speaking list will move to a vote on the sub-amendment. I think that we should have a Madam Clerk, if you would call the vote, I think it'll be helpful in terms of getting the exact numbers here.
All those in favor, please say yay. All those opposed, please say nay on the amendment of on the sub-amendment of Mr. Sorbera. Mr. Dong.
Yes.
Mr. Fergus.
Oui.
Ms. Latenzio.
Yes.
Ms. Shanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sorbera.
Yes.
Mr. Barrett.
Nay.
Dr. Carey.
Nay.
Monsieur Gould.
No.
Monsieur Fortin.
No.
Mr. Angus.
No.
Yeas pour 5. Nays contre 5.
Okay, so I will vote against the sub-amendment to allow for debate to continue. So debate on the amendment now. Is there any debate with regards to the amendment on the motion? Mr. Fergus.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Puis,
Thank you, Chair. And I'm very sorry that I missed the majority of the debate, but at this point, I do have a couple of things to say about the amendment. Amendment on the motion. Based on what I'm reading here, I think that the amendment on the motion doesn't go far enough. We know full well that that basically there was one thing that was brought up after the appearance of the Kielburger brothers before us, and that was the LinkedIn message. There were people who doubted that the correspondence with Mr. Chin was indeed that restricted, merely that communication, and that the Kielburgers proactively reached out to him or someone in the Kielburger office based on their testimony. Let me be more specific on that. But, Mr. Chair, no one has brought up the matter of Mr. Tace and Mr. Singh. It seems, at least it seems to me, that this is something that's just been cobbled together, given that these people's names were mentioned in passing, pretty much. So I certainly, of course, understand that it's important to get the document that will shortly become available. We certainly hope from the Privy Council Office Clerk's Office, and that's perfectly good, and we should receive it. This report on due diligence. Secondly, I feel that we can easily solve the issue of the communication with Mr. Chin merely by writing a letter to him. We're fully aware that there are consequences of his not telling the truth. It's most important that he do tell the truth, that he does tell the truth. Otherwise, we're going to be almost trying to draw this debate out indefinitely. And that would be all right if there were nothing else that we were seized of, nothing else that we're seized of to study. But we know full well that there are a number of very important issues that we are being asked to study, the study on Pornhub, for example. And, even more importantly, I thought that we were really just about to start our debate on facial recognition. I feel that this is of the highest importance, especially for people whose are brown-skinned, whose skin is not white. People like myself, we know very well that this type of software, this type of surveillance software is, so inaccurate. So we do need to address this issue. It's been some 13 months that we've been awaiting the beginning of a debate on it. And right now we looked like we were getting to the point where we could roll our sleeves up and get to work on the report on We Charity, really do the work that we need to carry out. And I think that, we need to take action. We need to get going. Mr. Angus is, of course, a colleague whom I have the highest opinion of, and he has said that we should, justify why we wouldn't want political involvement. I just want to be very clear on this. If we could get a letter from Mr. Chin, then consequently we wouldn't need to have Mr. Tice and Mr. Singh come and testify before us. We know very well that the Prime Minister and the Secretary of the Cabinet, Ms. Telford, have already been heard on these issues, and no new issue about the political personnel, has come up, other than for this message on LinkedIn. That's why I think we could settle this very quickly, without wasting time, precious committee time, by writing to Mr. Chin, asking him to clarify. And Mr. Chair, I am quite sure that you are able to write up this letter. I have full confidence in you, that you would be able to pen it in a way that would clearly define broad scope to ensure that nothing is lost in this endeavor. I think this would be the very best way to solve this problem. Of course, if the problem is not solved by this and we need to take further action, yes, indeed, we might take further action, make a decision as we go along. But I don't want to, good heavens, be losing time, losing the committee's time by, running after something that could be solved via a very clear letter, which our chair might write to solve the situation. So, I think that, it's so important. I think this will solve the problem. I indeed hope that this will meet all the requirements of the members of the opposition, who are, of course, looking for the clear details that we need to correctly draw up our report on We Charity. And in so doing, it will allow us to move forward quickly on issues that are extremely important. And time is of the essence. We need to solve all these problems. Mr. Chair, I would like to hear my colleagues on this, but I certainly hope that this will meet their needs.
We have a speaking list here. Is Mr. Sobera, followed by Mr. Barrett, followed by Ms. Latanzio. Mr. Sobera.
Actually, Chair, I would actually, my colleague, Parliamentary Secretary Fergus, actually stated what I was going to state in terms of trying to get to the committee to a point where we can move forward, and in reference to MP Angus's earlier comments at the beginning of the session, in terms of landing on a spot that we can move forward, and then obviously tackling Bill C11, which I know is important to many colleagues, and to tidying up, or finishing up, I should say, the Mind Hub, Mind Geek Porn Hub study that we're also doing.
Very good. We'll turn to Mr. Barrett. Mr. Barrett.
Yep, thanks very much, Chair. So yeah, I'm sensitive to the questions about what we're going to be doing next as a committee. As I previously stated, I think that the items dealt with in this motion can be resolved, inside of a week. We dedicated the equivalent of 20 meetings to not doing anything except living through a filibuster. So with respect, the amount of time the committee has not been doing other things is not the it's not reasonable to say that the opposition is looking to rag the puck. It's these are germane questions, and the issue of the message with Mr. Chin does reignite the questions that were raised about the genesis or the origins of the Canada Student Service Grant. And Mr. Tice and Mr. Singh were both revealed in the document release from last summer to have had contact. One, Mr. Tice was sent a message by Mr. Craig Kielburger with the information about a suite of options with respect to programs that they could choose from. That was last May, and the same is true, of course, of communication between Mr. Singh and we, the We organization, and now we have the question about Mr. Chin and the We organization. So we're not starting the study over again. We're looking to resolve these questions. That can be done in one day. That could be done Friday of this week. We could also have that response from PCO. It was offered many months ago, and so I expect that it is prepared. And there has been some unexpected changes, and particularly with respect to Mr. Schugert's absence, his legitimate absence from his role. And so give them a couple days to get that together. The document would have been created last spring if it was created, and so they could furnish the committee with that. The same is true of Mr. Lee's responses, his fulsome responses following the letter that the committee has instructed the chair to write. So and the question about C11, the committee hasn't been given C11 from the House, and so once that happens, then there will be some urgency there. But there are other matters that the committee has expressed that they would like to deal with, and we can do that. And as I said before, we could be moving ahead with that as early as the end of next week or next week, should we resolve this week. Now, Ms. Latanzio asked, if there would be a commitment that there would be no further questions. Well, sometimes the work that we do, causes more questions to be asked. But my intention is that we wrap this up, and I think that we can wrap it up with we hear from these witnesses, and we get the information that we're requesting, and then we can provide instructions to the analysts. I think that that's very reasonable, and the clarification that can be provided by these individuals to the committee in answer to the questions. Yep, sure, we could write a letter. But if we're doing this in the interest of time and we're writing letters to 3 different individuals and then they write back to us and on and on and on, we're not going to have this wrapped up in short order. We'll be dealing with this in June. And that is not an outcome that I would prefer. And I expect, based on the comments of my colleagues opposite, that's not the outcome that they prefer. The most expeditious way for us to dispose of this study with relation to pandemic spending and conflict of interest, potential conflicts of interest, is to just call the witnesses as we normally do. This practice of writing letters, so we made an exception with respect to an individual who was on medical leave, and now I think that we return to business as normal. We call the witnesses, and that's the why those witnesses specifically are being referenced. We're not looking to have people reappear. We're not asking for the Prime Minister to come to this committee. We're not asking for his Chief of Staff. We're looking for 3 very specific people based on correspondence and communication. And that communication, the evidence of that, contradicts what we'd heard previously or evidence in other committees. So the multiple communications between Mr. Singh and the WE organization, the communications between Mr. Tice and one of the founders of the WE organization, and the question with respect to Mr. Chin. I mean, if he's appearing, and he has no other information to offer, my goodness, that would be a pretty quick panel for us to dispose of. So we can do that, and in the interest of time, we can vote on this now, and we can give our instructions to the chair, and we will be off to the races, and hopefully disposing of this work, or concluding this work, reporting it to the House, and moving on to the many other important subjects that this committee has decided that they would undertake.
Thank you. Two last speakers on the speaking list. Ms. Latanzio, followed by, Ms. Latanzio, your name's no longer on, or your hand's no longer there. But if you'd like to intervene, you were on my list next, and then Mr. Angus to follow. Ms. Latanzio.
Mr. Chair, I'm eager to hear from my colleague, Mr. Angus, and reserve my right to come back right after him as we're discussing how to best manage and time manage this issue. So I'll let him go before me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very
good. Mr. Angus, we'll turn to you.
Thank you.
Again, we are debating the amendment.
Yes. I really think we need to move forward because we have a lot of work to do, and I can see that we're starting to get locked down, which is I don't want to return to. The issue of writing letters to the 3 men, I agree with my colleague, Mr. Barrett. It does start to set a dangerous precedent that we actually are writing letters to people instead of having them testify. That will be used as a precedent in the future. My suggestion that a compromise would be that we call Ben Chin, because it's based on the fact that he was named in the testimony last week. Rick Tice and Mr. Singh are in the documents. There was nothing new from what I heard from the Kielburger testimony that makes me think that anything that we've already known, that we're going to learn something else. I do think we do need to clear this up about this LinkedIn message. It just the answer to Mr. Kielburger struck me as odd. It may be very straightforward. I imagine it probably is. So I would suggest that an amendment to the amendment is that the committee call Ben Chin, and we leave Mr. Tice and Mr. Singh out. Therefore, we're just responding to the testimony we heard. We're getting clarification. We could have that done by Friday, as Mr. Barrett says. We could get our instructions and we could start to move on. But the issue of the Pornhub study is really vitally important. I urge my colleagues to read all the letters and presentations that are being sent to us. This is not just in Canada. People around the world are watching. It is incumbent upon us to finish this. And to Mr. Fergus, who's been my biggest supporter in trying to get this facial recognition technology study done, I have put my witnesses in. I hope other people do. I'm ready to move on that at any time. So I would amend the amendment with that we call Ben Chin.
Okay, now we're on to a new sub amendment, and again, we'll ask Mr. Angus to work with the clerk to get that in writing and be distributed to members. So we will suspend until such time as that's circulated to members. When it gets to your email, we'll reconvene the meeting. Meeting suspended. Ms. Shanahan. Mr. Fergus.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Puis,
Thank you very much, Chair. Now, before I speak to the sub-amendment on the amendment that has been made, it may nevertheless be relevant to share the following. It seems to me that the matter of the correspondence between someone in the office of or the assistant of Mr. Kilbergs who sent a message to Mr. Chin on LinkedIn, well, Mr. Chair, I merely wish to say, and really sincerely from the bottom of my heart, that this point has been brought up already during the summer. If my memory serves me well, our colleague in the official opposition, Mr. Poilievre, recognized this point, brought this point forward and discussed it in the Finance Committee, if I remember correctly. But nothing further came of the point that he had brought forward then. So this isn't a new fact. This is something that was brought up 6 months ago now. So perhaps I'm just not sufficiently imaginative. I'm just, lack imagination. I'm not seeing clearly, but I don't see where the relevance is. Why this is relevant, other than the fact that Mr. Kielberger just, mentioned this name. So once again, to my good colleague, Mr. Barrett, who has brought up the possibility that we would have only one day, a couple of hours of our time scheduled to address this. Well, Mr. Chair, this is the sort of thing that we hear very often, isn't it? So I would like to go back to the point I've made, to the effect that there's nothing new here. This may be settled with a letter. This is something that was brought up 6 months ago. It didn't seem relevant then. Everyone found that there was nothing worth pursuing here. So I don't want to let the committee's time be swallowed up by this matter, given that we have other files that we're seized of, other issues we want to deal with. Moreover, we still have work to do in drawing up our report, giving instructions for writing our report on weed charity. I think that the sooner we could get to work on that, the better it will be. So this simply seems perhaps useless to hear from someone in testimony for 2 hours on a matter that might almost be answered. Of course, I'm exaggerating. I fully agree. This is an exaggeration that might be answered with a yes or a no. And I'm sure colleagues will wish to intervene and ask questions themselves. But all said and done, Mr. Chair, the issue will remain as it is. We have this correspondence, this LinkedIn message involving Mr. Kielberger, and there are a number of ways we can go about putting our question, but the question will not change for all that. And that is why I certainly hope that I'll be able to convince my colleagues to solve this as quickly as possible. Just because we have the power to bring witnesses before us doesn't mean that we always need to do so. With Pornhub and We Charity as well, of course, we are empowered to use different approaches, such as by sending out letters requiring clarification of our witnesses. So there's nothing new to that either. And I do think that would be the most efficient method in this situation, and that we should definitely use it. Mr. Chair, I hope that my colleagues will see clearly in this matter and support my point of view so that we'll be able to move on to other pressing issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. So speaking to the sub-amendment, I really do appreciate the effort by Mr. Angus to help this committee to get to in the completion of this work so that we can get to other work. But in the same way that Mr. Fergus said that you know, in bringing up Mr. Chin, that the only mention of Mr. Chin was by Mr. Kielberger referring to a LinkedIn message. I think that the nature of that involvement, especially after 7 months and opposition members going through, all of us going through reams and reams of documents with a fine-tooth comb on this issue, that it's I think that it can be dispensed with very quickly if there is an outstanding question with a letter from yourself, with a request from yourself, just as we ask witnesses to do all the time to provide us with written documentation. I think that that this matter can be dispensed with very quickly, and we can move on to. And I do agree with Mr. Angus. The material that we have received just recently regards to MindGeek is very disturbing, and I think that we owe it to Canadians to get back to that work. I think that on this issue of the WE study, we can dispense with it very quickly and that was the effort that we made in the sub-amendment that we had earlier. It's just requesting the answer to the committee's questions, and let's move on. Thank you.
Mr. Dong.
Thank you, Chair, for recognizing me. A couple of things. One is Mr. Chain's name and the work LinkedIn exchange was brought up by Mr. Polyev in the Kilberger's meeting, and this is not new. I remember an article going back to last summer that Mr. Polyev mentioned this, and so just and he subbed in, of course, the last meeting, and he brought up this, and now that we are locked in this this debate on whether or not have Mr. Chain to come to the committee to testify. I agree that we need to get a confirmation directly from Mr. Chain. I think writing letter is a good, efficient method, quite effectively as well, because it's that's sort of the final piece that's thrown in from the last meeting. But with that information is not new, and if it wasn't included in the previous work plan, given that it was old information, I have a tough time to understand the significance of this having him to come in. So that's my first point. The second point is that I heard about the president's setting. From my time on this committee, there were a lot of president's setting. First we talked about whether or not prime minister's family member should get involved. At the end, their document was called and reviewed. And there wasn't anything substantial new information that we found from that action. So that to me was, and I spoke in length against that because I don't think family members should be brought in. We run, and it's a personal decision. We put ourselves under the scope of the public for accountability and transparency. That I understand, and for me, it's a matter of principle of whether or not members of family members of MPs should be subject to, to unveil their own personal privacy and story. And we heard early on that a lot of support, including mine, to Mr. Angus on not getting involved, not getting. We have to defend the final line to protect our family members. So that's the president's setting. And now on staff, I don't believe it's a tradition to call on political staff or staff of MP's office just because the name was mentioned and brought up by a opposition member on the committee questioning something that happened and or being reported on half 6-7 months ago. I just don't think that is a good thing or a good tradition to have. And I remember that there was a question to Miss Telfer when she showed up at FINA, and she specifically said, I'm here on behalf of all staff. So I think the question that's being asked put to Miss Telfer, and she speaks or she spoke on behalf of staff members, and I think that's enough. When it comes to this particular question about Mr. Ching's involvement with the We Charity entity, and I think the response has been, the answer we've heard is clear that he has nothing to do and he has no involvement in the We Charity. So we just need to confirm that, and a formal letter is more than enough to do that. So I feel like we're going in circles, and now we're deadlocked in this argument, and that triggered by a question came from Mr. Polyev in the last meeting, and with some old information. I just don't think that we should waste any more time on calling another witness in, because I was under the impression the work plan is to move on to finalize the report. So that's my point. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think that we have exhausted the speaking list here now. So let's go to a vote in terms of the sub-amendment. I think we'll ask the clerk again to do a recorded vote.
Sur le sous-amendement de Mr. Angus, Mr.
I vote no.
Mr. Fergus,
Je vote no.
Ms. Latenzio, Ms. Latenzio,
No.
Ms.
Can you hear me?
Shanahan,
No.
Mr. Sorbera,
No, clerk.
Mr. Barrett,
Nay.
Dr. Carey,
Nay.
Monsieur Gould,
No.
Monsieur Fortin,
No.
Mr. Angus.
Ben oui.
Yeas pour 1, nays contre 9.
Okay, the sub-amendment has been defeated, so we'll move to debate on the amendment. I don't have a speaking list here for this. Mr. Fergus.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Of course, clearly, I will speak against the main motion, and for a number of reasons. Chair, I do believe that we are here creating, how shall I put it, creating a controversy, basically creating a controversy where there really isn't one. Just because someone mentioned a name, the name of a witness, who appeared before us last week and also mentioned the same name in the same context over 6 months ago. And by the way, 6 months ago, we didn't think there was anything to this. And I'm sure, Mr. Chair, that the same thing is the case now. And here you have people who played, well, I call to order, or point of order, with all due respect to my colleague, Mr. Fergus. I thought, Chair, that you were calling for point of order. Point of order. Yes, Mr. Fortin. Thank you, Chair. With all due respect to our colleague, Mr. Fergus, I don't think he's speaking to the proper issue, given that what you brought up to the committee was the amendment, which intends to take away the second to last paragraph of the motion, removing Mr. Schugert's appearance. And so I think this is out of order.
Fergus, to remain on the debate that we're currently undertaking, but we'll extend some latitude in terms of that, Mr. Fergus.
Et merci beaucoup, Mr. Président.
Thank you, Chair. And, well, I know that our clerk is fully aware of this, given that we've been exchanging texts, but I always find it difficult in committee to receive the texts of amendments, sub-amendments live while we're here. I'm not sure why, but for some reason they don't seem to land in my inbox, in my email inbox. So if you would just give me a moment, I will look for the information in my private email, my personal email, where I can receive material directly from the clerk. Perhaps I'm in error, actually. Perhaps that's my fault that I don't have the actual wording in front of me. So, but if you will give me a moment, I will look for the text. I'll have it before me, and then, yes, I will be in a better position to speak to it, because I do think that fundamentally my point is worth hearing.
Mr. Barrett, will turn to you, Mr. Barrett.
Yeah, so for Mr. Fergus's benefit, the amendment is just the removal of the second of 3 paragraphs. So it's just, it omits calling a representative from PCO to speak to the report. So that's the change. There's no addition to the main motion. The amendment that we're debating is just the removal of the paragraph 2 of 3, and that's to not have someone from PCO come to speak to the due diligence report.
Thank you, Mr. Fergus.
Si je peux, et je remercie mon
I would like to thank my colleagues, Mr. Fortin and Barrett, and I'm now in a better position to ask a question about this. So, did this always include personal assistants who would have been appearing before the committee? Chair.
Let's not get into a debate here, but I'll allow Monsieur Fortin to answer, and then I'd like to get to the vote. Monsieur Fortin.
Je disais simplement que.
Well, I was simply saying that that's not the point. The amendment basically strikes a paragraph here, withdraws a paragraph which was requesting either Mr. Schugert or any other member of the Privy Council office to appear before us. So that's all there is to it. It's been taken out. That being the case, Chair, I humbly submit that what I have to say is indeed most relevant, given that the effect of the amendment will be to allow there will be a consequence to voting on it, and I was explaining why I find that the amendment is insufficient. So I think that's very relevant. Chair, if you will allow me to continue, I shall.
Colleagues to move things along today, so I'm certain that you'll be able to certainly we'll turn back to you, but we're looking forward to voting on this expeditiously. Mr. Fergus.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. And I hope that you will allow me to ensure that this can be settled efficiently and as quickly as possible to ensure that the committee remain efficient in its activities. It's quite simple. Mr. Chair, I think the solution would be quite a simple one, as follows. Yes, we can ask for a report from the Privy Council office, and yes, that's important. We don't necessarily need the other people suggested in the amendment. We don't need to have someone appear before us to address the report or speak to the report. So, in that case, this would be a good thing to amend it. But, in fact, Chair, we are leaving open, I think that matters that are a kind of fishing expedition remain here. So how can we solve this? Well, we can solve it by asking that you, as our chair, that we authorize you to find the right way to draw up, using the right words that really address the heart of the matter, a letter to be written to Mr. Chin, requesting of him that he tell us about all his communications with the We Charity, the Organisme Uni in French, regarding the Canadian Student Service Grants, the Canada Student Service Grants program. And that would allow us to be very efficient and then allow us to move on to other matters that are relevant, including drawing up what will be, our work, the work that we need to carry out. Secondly, this will fully meet all the requirements and respond to the requests of the members of Parliament, members of this committee. So that's what I propose, Chair, understanding that my colleagues around the table are all in good faith, which I fully believe to be the case, Mr. Chair. And with your kind permission, and perhaps I could ask you, indeed, whether I may put forward a sub-amendment.
Mr. Fergus, if you'd like to move your sub-amendment now.
Super. Monsieur le Président.
Wonderful. Chair, if I'm not mistaken, I'm just trying to access the email which has been sent to my personal email address, given that I was unable to receive it from the House of Commons email that is mine. So, if I might then, an amendment to the motion after the words and Mr. Chair, we are out of order.
Monsieur Fortin, did you?
Monsieur Fortin. Yes, indeed, Chair. This is out of order. Unfortunately, Mr. Fortin's microphone is not on, or we are not hearing him.
Monsieur Fortin, excusez-moi. There's an issue with your microphone. Maybe your headset is no longer on. Very good. There we go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, Mr. Chair. This is totally out of order. With all due respect, I don't think we can be amending. I mean, look, we're discussing an amendment put forward by Mr. Barnett to withdraw and delete the second paragraph. Mr. Fergus has already said that he agrees with this, so I don't see why he's now putting forward an amendment on something else. I mean, that's not what we're dealing with. Could we get somewhere, please? I mean, it's 1:10. I know that we have this custom filibuster and so on, and that we sort of set into this as of last fall, but I don't have much patience for this. I mean, it's childish. We have something before us here. We vote for or against it, and then if Mr. Fergus wants to come back with something else, he can do so. But right now, we've got something clear before us. He said he agrees, so let's not play around.
Hear the sub-amendment, and then I'm going to rule as to if or not it's in order. Mr. Fergus.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, perhaps once again, well, at the outset, I really do feel that I must say that if I've correctly understood, if my understanding is correct, Mr. Fortin's comments, weren't necessarily, I mean, of course, I have full respect for him, but
We're just trying to get the sub-amendment. Could you give us the text of the sub-amendment so that can be distributed to the members?
Certainement, Monsieur le Président. Mais Monsieur le Président.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. But, Chair, there's a right way of going about things. And when members of Parliament use language that is less than respectful, they do not show due respect for their colleagues, this is not the right way to proceed. We're all members of Parliament. We are all held to be honourable members of Parliament, and we are held to show full respect one to the other at all times, ensuring that we treat our colleagues with due deference and respect. And I would just like to tell Mr.
I do agree with you. It is necessary for us to respect one another, including our time. I would like to circulate the text of your sub-amendment to the members.
Point of order, Chair. Point of order.
Mr. Dong, point of order.
Point of order, Chair. I Mr. Fergus just being called acting like a child from another colleague from the opposite party, opposition party. I think he has the right to kind of respond to that, and I think
Mr. Dong, that's not a point of order, but Mr. Dong, that's not a point of order, but I appreciate the reminder to all members to keep the conversation courteous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Fergus, out of courtesy to the members, would you distribute the would you read into the record the text of the sub-amendment that you're proposing so that could be distributed to the members so that we can be courteous of members' times? Mr. Fergus.
I certainly will, Mr. Chair, but I hope that Mr. J'aimerais que Monsieur Fortin.
I would like Mr. Fortin to show, just out of politeness, just to withdraw his comments, please, so that we could indeed continue to show the due respect one to the other that is so important. Of course, we're all passionate about our work, but we must avoid excessive language about each other. Monsieur Fortin.
Put your headset back on.
So I was asking if I could respond to Mr. Fergus, Chair. So I would simply... I just want to point out that I've not accused Mr. Fergus of anything whatsoever. I merely spoke to the behavior that he was engaging in at that time. It seemed to me that that behavior seemed to be childish, at least certainly any behavior where you're exhausting time talking about something endlessly. And I'm so sorry, I have little patience for such behavior, but I have far too much respect for Mr. Fergus to feel that he's, out of order. I think it was just indiscreet, and I'm so sorry. I do get exasperated in such situations. That's just the case, Chair.
Consider the matter closed, Mr. Fergus.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, that was not an proper excuse. Apology, not an apology.
Monsieur Fortin.
Oui, mais
I'm apologizing.
If you'd like to interject one last time, and then I'd like to move the business of the committee forward.
je suis prêt à passer au vote, Monsieur le Président.
I'm ready to move to a vote, Chair. I'm not sure where you are, but I have nothing else to add. I'm certainly not going to apologize. I don't see why I should apologize. I just said that I become impatient when people behave in childish ways. If Mr. Fergus thinks this requires an apology, well,
Colleagues, it would be helpful if we can debate the matter that's before our committee in terms of the amendment and the sub-amendment that's being proposed by Mr. Fergus. I would now ask Mr. Fergus to read into the record the text that he is proposing.
Monsieur le Président, je veux
Mr. Chair, I truly want to ensure that I follow your good indications, but once again, I do find that what Mr. Fortin has said is inexcusable. I'm not sure why he's insisting on this.
Mr. Angus.
Yes, I think what we're seeing here is childish behavior because we have serious issues to deal with. A colleague has been asked to withdraw his remark, and he's withdrawn it. We have been asking Mr. Fergus to come up with the language of the sub-amendment. Either he has it or he doesn't. But to continue to try and poke a fight with Mr. Fortin, to me, is not credible. We have wasted a lot of time here. So we've been told time and time by the Liberals that they want to get down to work. So let's get down to work. Does he actually have wording of a motion that actually may be in order? Because it may not be in order. And I think that's what I want to know. I want to know, does he actually have language for the motion? So can he get to that, please?
Yeah, I have asked Mr. Fergus to do that several times. Mr. Fergus, we're anticipating the...
Mr. Chair, to be fair...
Mr. Fergus.
Are you telling me that there was a withdrawal of the comment?
That was my understanding. That was how I heard it. That's how I heard the conversation. Mr. Fergus
didn't hear that, sir.
That's how I heard it. Mr. Fergus, we'll turn to you for the sub-amendment.
So for the record, there was a withdrawal of comment.
That's how I understood translation that I heard. That is what I heard.
That's the way that you were reading it, sir.
Point of order, Chair.
Point of order, Mr. Barrett.
Chair, you ruled that the matter was closed. The member opposite is required to speak to the motion at hand, and on a question of relevance, the sub-amendment the amendment is being debated unless there is a motion that is being put forward that will then be ruled on by the chair whether or not is in order. But if we're not discussing those things and the point of order has been ruled closed by the chair, then any other comments would be out of order.
I appreciate that, Mr. Fergus. You can understand that there is a desire by the committee to move forward to a vote. If you'd like to propose a sub-amendment, I would encourage you to do it now. Otherwise, we can pursue. Okay.
Point of order, Chair. I've been listening to this exchange and back and forth.
Mr. Dong is. I just want to make sure that this is a point of order, not a point of debate.
It is a point of order, Chair.
Mr. Dong.
I just feel that you said you made a ruling. Your interpretation, the comment was wrong. But none of us actually heard Monsieur Fortin said to withdraw.
Then challenge the chair. Then challenge the chair.
Pardon me, colleagues. I'm going to call this meeting back to order. I did not state that Mr. Fortin's language was unparliamentary. I did not rule that. I did not call him to withdraw the comment. Mr. Fergus was offended. He can take that up with Mr. Fortin. But I would suggest that happened in a private conversation and not at this committee. I did not demand anybody withdraw a comment. Mr. Fergus requested a withdrawal. It wasn't forthcoming to his satisfaction. That is between him and Mr. Fortin. That's a private conversation that probably should happen But quite frankly, this chair has not ruled his Monsieur Fortin's language unparliamentary, and therefore there is nothing that is required to be withdrawn.
That's contradicting to what Mr. Barrett said.
Mr. Dong,
Wow.
we're not going to continue with regards to a debate. I am the chair.
Yeah.
I have not ruled that unparliamentary language was used, and therefore let's move on to the text of the sub-amendment.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Angus.
Sorry, I just want to get on the record because it is a very difficult job to be chair, and I think that what you're being subjected to is not fair, and I think it is. These are delaying tactics, and I want to say that I have confidence in the chair. If the Liberals, Mr. Dong, doesn't have confidence in the chair, he has a mechanism rather than saying, "Oh wow." He can challenge the chair. If Mr. Fergus wants to continue this fight, he can challenge the chair. But you ruled that this was finished. And as chair, you represent all of us. And so I accept your ruling. I think it's a wise ruling. I think you're trying to get to the heart of the matter so we can get back on track. And I would say to my Liberal colleagues, either challenge the chair or let's move on and actually hear if Mr. Fergus does have an amendment that is in order. That's what I'm interested in hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Colleagues, I think it would be helpful for us to move on. Mr. Fergus, if you do have the text of the sub-amendment, that'll allow us to suspend the meeting so that can be circulated to the members, and then we can vote on it, Mr. Fergus.
We'll see you, Mr. Chair, if you find this motion to be, this sub-amendment to be in order. So it is to amend the motion after the words adoption of this motion and replace with that the chair write to Mr. Ben Chin and ask him to provide in writing to confirm any communications he had with the Kielburgers or We Charity in regard to the CSSG.
Can you explain to the committee members how that's sub-amendment that was proposed?
It is
the one that was proposed by Mr. Dong specifically.
It is substantively different in that, Mr. Chair, we are moving away. We are allowing for the clerk to continue to, or representative of the clerk to represent, to bring forward the report, which we would have, as well as by making sure that we are trying to move that the communications is just larger than the LinkedIn aspect of it. And I make it sound, put it out that it is the any communication with regard to the CSSG, which makes it different. And I'm also requesting that there be written testimony that would be submitted to this committee and to all members who sit on this committee. And it doesn't presuppose the outcome, which is what was the previous amendment or sub-amendment that was suggested. For those reasons, sir, I think it's substantively different.
I respectfully disagree. I believe that it's substantively the same as the previous one that was already voted on. So let us now move to the vote on the amendment. If we can have a recorded vote on that. Mr.
Chair.
Mr. Fergus, yes. Point of order is that?
I'm not certain if it's a point of order or if it's an actual motion. Mr. Chair, very respectfully, I disagree.
Are you challenging the chair?
Which is why, sir, I would like to challenge the chair.
Okay, so the question would be is if the chair's ruling is sustained, we'll now move to a recorded vote on that. We'll move to the clerk to call that recorded vote.
On the question that shall the chair's ruling be sustained, Mr. Dong.
Nay.
Mr. Fergus.
Respectfully, nay.
Ms. Latancio.
No.
Ms. Shanahan.
No.
Mr. Sorbera. Mr. Sorbera?
No, no.
Mr. Barrett?
I support the chair, yes.
Dr. Carey?
Yes.
Monsieur Gould?
Oui.
Monsieur Fortin?
Oui.
Mr. Angus?
I support the chair.
Okay, so the chair's ruling is sustained. Colleagues, let's move then to the amendment. The amended motion is, let's move to recorded vote on that. We'll move to that, Madam Clerk. A vote on the amendment.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. Just a point of information or order. I see Mr. Fortin's hand up.
Oh, Monsieur Fortin, were you on the speaking list? No.
Non, c'est une erreur.
Very good. We'll move to the,
No, that's a mistake.
and Madam Clerk, the recorded, I've called the vote.
On Mr. Barrett's amendment, Mr. Dong?
I understand the amendments to take away the part for Mr. Sugar to attend. For that, I agree.
I'm sorry?
Yes. Yes.
Mr. Fergus?
Oui.
Ms. Latancio?
Yes.
Ms. Shanahan?
Yes.
Mr. Sorbera?
Yes.
Mr. Barrett?
Yay.
Dr. Carey?
Yes.
Monsieur Gould?
Wait.
Monsieur Fortin?
Oui.
Mr. Angus?
Yes.
10 yeas, 0 nays.
Okay,
Excellent.
very
So
good.
we have a unanimous. That's excellent. I think that's sort of. Could we just read that? Could we read what we've just voted on?
Let's actually suspend. We'll have that circulated to members so that they have it in hand. Well, it has been circulated already. So let's just verify we'll allow members to look through that again. This is the email that was circulated. It is Mr. Barrett's amendment, so the motion as amended.
I'm ready
So
to
I
vote
do
on the
have
main
a-
motion. We don't need to hear the amendment.
Very good. We'll move to Mr. We have got a couple of people, 3 people on the speaking list. Mr. Fergus to begin.
Actually, Mr. Not that I'm shy to take the microphone, but it was actually Madam Shanahan who was before me, sir.
My list has you first. Ms. Shanahan, we'll turn to you.
Thank you, Chair. And I have to say that I think this committee has been trying to get to a better place on this motion. And so I do welcome the fact that we are not asking Mr. Sugar to appear and that we respect the fact that he has made a commitment to this committee to provide a report, and we know that that he will certainly do so in reasonable time. It's the other part of this motion that is most concerning, and I have to say, as someone who doesn't tend to get involved in the day-to-day fracas of partisan debate, it has been quite something to watch the Conservatives operating over the past few months, and especially how they've been trying to shift the conversation in the political arena. And I think we have certainly seen that in the media, but even the media has gotten tired of this story and all its permutations and variations. In fact, when I'm watching the news and when I'm speaking to my constituents, the constituents that are calling into my office, the news that they want to talk about, the information that they want to have, the to do with when they're going to get their vaccine and when are we going to see a return to some kind of post-pandemic normal, and in fact, what are our next steps in relaunching the economy? But apparently, we is still on the minds of Mr. Barrett, and we had Mr. Polyev last week, making his appearance here at this committee because that's what they want to talk about. That is what conservatives want to talk about. They just want to talk about bringing up an old story, something that has been gone over many, many times. There was a time, actually, that the Conservatives were addressing the vaccine issue. And indeed, that is the role of opposition, and we certainly respect that. These were the main topics that were being brought up in question period back in January and February. And then all of a sudden it stopped. We saw Mr. Polyev doing his little videos on Twitter, but it's funny that the subject of concern, would change so dramatically because when we committee was all he wanted to talk about, that's all that we saw, and yet that disappeared in December, January, February, as if, and indeed, I think that's what many of us felt, that issue had been put to bed, amply so, concerning the We Charity and from the point of view of the Finance Committee. For us, we still had some tail end testimony to take care of, and we certainly thought that that's where we were going, was to get that done on the issue before us regarding the pandemic spending, if there were issues of lobbying and so on. But no, it that sort of disappeared because it looked like the Conservatives have moved on to something else. And they thought that would be, the fact that there were job losses. Well, I think we all know there was a pandemic going on. There was definitely job losses. In fact, those job losses were most keenly felt amongst women in the service sector. And it's something that certainly our side takes very seriously. And we certainly want to be addressing those issues. But there was a kind of a torquing going on and a fear campaign that somehow vaccines weren't coming and that people were out of jobs and we were all going to hell in a handbasket. Well, lo and behold, vaccines arrived, Chair. They arrived and they are arriving on a daily basis. And every day we're seeing more and more vaccines arriving.
Point of order.
And I know.
Order, recognizing Mr. Angus.
Well, there's a question of relevance. We aren't the health committee. I don't know why we're descending into this sideshow on vaccines. If the Liberals are going to spend another 40 hours of filibustering, perhaps they could just tell us in advance. But in issues of relevance, vaccines has nothing to do with the discussion at hand.
Thank you. Ms. Shanahan, we will recommend, I would recommend and ask that you while I've given significant leeway today, I would ask that you move to the amended motion that we're currently debating, and I will start to be a little bit more restrictive in terms of where I'll allow committee members to go and how far they'll be allowed to venture.
Well, Chair, I'm sorry that members on this committee feel that vaccines are not an issue of importance. Because,
point of order.
Recognizing the point of order. Point of order.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the need to be snide. on an issue as serious as a pandemic is very becoming on someone on the government side. I never said vaccines wasn't important. And so if they're going to make these personal attacks, I think we're going to be looking at a long filibusters. I think they should stick to the point.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. I do appreciate that. That isn't a point of order, but I think we all will take note of the conversation that happened earlier, Ms. Shanahan, between Mr. Fergus and Mr. Fortin, that sometimes language can be unhelpful. Ms. Shanahan.
Indeed, and I withdraw any remark that I made that would have disparaged the good intentions of anyone on this committee. But indeed, it is what this study is about. This study is about pandemic spending. It is about the different programs and measures that the government put together very quickly in a period of crises to address the many sectors that were affected by the pandemic, and certainly the measures that were taken to control the pandemic, which of course was the economic lockdown. And that is indeed in the very title of the 106, the motion that is before us here, in that it's a meeting requested by 4 members of the committee to discuss their request for further documents and testimony in relation to the study concerning questions of conflict of interest and lobbying in relation to pandemic spending. That's in the 106.4 motion that we are discussing here today. So I would like to continue with the remarks that I would like to make regarding the measures that were taken and the fact that it was all hands on deck, that the staff, public servants, parliamentarians of all stripes, if you recall, it seems like eons ago, but we were all hands on deck consulting with each other and trying to put those measures into place. And so, and who would have thought at that time that we would be here today where we actually are delivering vaccines, and vaccines are getting into arms. So that's why, Chair, I could understand that the Conservative Party would talk about the importance of jobs and vaccines. This was very important, and they completely dropped the WE study. And I'd like to reassure the Conservative members that the latest job numbers look great, that the vaccine deliveries are continued, not only as scheduled, but better than scheduled, that the numbers recently released by Statistics Canada reveal that Canadians have recovered more than 259,000 jobs in February alone, that the national unemployment rate fell to 8.2%. This is the lowest level since March 2020 at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. These figures blew past expectations of a gain of 75,000 and of an unemployment rate of 9.2%. Mr. Chair, this government's plan to help Canadians and Canadian businesses is working, and the numbers show it, despite what Mr. Poilievre and others in his party want to make us believe. Mr. Chair, my colleagues don't need to take it from me. Let me share 2 quotes while we're on this subject. The International Monetary Fund said last week about Canada's economy, public health policies and spending were instrumental in containing the initial spread of the virus. Crucially,
Ms. Shanahan, I did say that I was going to limit the latitude in terms of this debate, as I've said that it needs to be attributed to the amended motion. Ms. Shanahan, I'd ask you to bring it back to the amended motion.
Well, Mr. Chair, the amended motion is calling for the appearance of a employee to speak to their involvement in putting together a measure, a government program to address one of the economic side effects, some of the fallout from from COVID. So I think that it's germane to speak about how already that good work has been furthering the Canadian economy, and we are seeing the results. Indeed,
Madame Shanahan, I'm not looking to debate as to whether or not you were into the territory that was no longer relevant. I had ruled that it was no longer relevant. So what I'd like is for you to move to the debate with regards to the motion that has been amended that's currently before the committee.
So, Chair, it is the time of this committee that is very precious. And we have offered earlier today amendments, sub-amendments that would address the very issues that the opposition has put forward in this motion. They want to hear about Mr. Chin's involvement regarding the LinkedIn email that Mr. Kielburger mentioned. And we certainly agree that it's appropriate to have some communication, and that can be expedited by a simple letter from the chair. But this is what I'm concerned about, is that the opposition is using committees for their fishing expeditions. Luckily for us, the Conservatives are not in government, because as we witnessed this weekend at the convention that was held, the denial of climate change. Now, there's a debate that
Sorry, point of order.
any committee could be having.
Point of order, recognizing point of order.
Well, I certainly agree that the issue of climate change is a debate, but it's not a debate for this committee. This is the Privacy and Ethics Committee. So again, we're seeing filibuster. We need to get this so that we can get on to other issues like the Pornhub study. So, question of relevance.
I have warned Ms. Shanahan several times. So Ms. Shanahan, we're going to move on to the next speaker, Mr. Sobera. We'll turn to you, Mr. Sobera.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, my question is very simple. It's more of a request. I've received several emails from the clerk today in terms of where we are in today's debate. I'm requesting that we please be sent the version of the motion that we are dealing with at this moment in time. I've received, I think, a number of emails with lots of lines scratched out, wording changes and so forth. I would like to make sure for my own safety, in terms of understanding where we are at the point of the debate and where the motion is that. So I'm humbly requesting you, Chair, through the clerk, to have that motion now be sent to everyone and stuff. So I want to make sure I'm debating and speaking to the right thing. There's been a lot of amendments moved and a lot of sub-amendments moved. And I just want to make sure I'm on track and stuff. And so
thank you. To make it easy, it's the second paragraph that has been removed and all else remains the same, but we will get that distributed. Mr. Fergus.
Chair, point of order.
Point of order, Ms. Shanahan.
Chair, I respectfully ask you to inform this committee of where the rule is that you can move on, that you can deny me my right to speak. I take it that you can ask me to continue. On the motion, I was attempting to do so, but I do not believe that you can just cut me off.
Yeah, thanks, Ms. Shanahan. It is a requirement and a rule that the chair is to maintain order. I had asked you several times to move to irrelevance, to relevance, and it was causing disorder that you weren't. Therefore, I cut you off. Mr. Fergus.
Désolé, Monsieur le Président, j'étais juste en train de trouver la motion que Monsieur Francesco, Monsieur Sabara nous a demandé par vous pour être certain.
Mr. Serba asked us through you. I just want to be sure. I'm sorry. I was just looking for the right text. I just want to be really sure that we do have the right version, and I think it's a proper request that we have the latest version before us and be reassured of that so that we're all on the same wavelength. Because, Mr. Chair, I certainly don't want to find myself in a situation where I will be inaccurately responding to your interpretation of what is or is not in a motion. So to ensure that I am able to be very clear and follow your directions clearly as well, would it be possible to receive the very last email? Hang on, the one that I received in my personal file here.
Juste le recevoir à 13h47.
Very good. 1337. It just came into my mailbox. Thank you so much, Chair. And through you, Chair, thank you to the clerk. Once again, it still didn't go to my House of Commons mailbox. This is really something I'll need to solve with the correct authorities, but that's not relevant to our discussion here today. So, Mr. Chair, the motion now before us, and I do respectfully ask for your confirmation of this. It's about Standing Order 108.3H of the Standing Order. The committee requests to receive from the Liberal Government's Privy Council the due diligence report concerning the assignment of the Canada Student Service Grant. That the document be translated beforehand. Yes, that is beforehand, and that it be submitted to the clerk of the committee in both official languages not later than 5 days after the adoption of this motion. And then it goes on from there. I believe that the lines after that were deleted, and that's been replaced by the amended motion, if I understand you correctly, Mr. Chair, and that in light of revelations stemming from Craig and Mark Kielberger's testimony of March 15th, 2021, the committee do call for Ben Chin, Rick Tice, and Amit Pal Singh to appear before the committee at a date and time, yes, to be determined by the chair, but no later than 1 week following the adoption of this motion. So I believe that that is very specifically the motion that is now being debated. Perhaps you could just reassure me, Mr. Chair, that this is correct in all details, and then I'll be able to add something, Chair.
Related most recently, Mr. Burgess.
Merci beaucoup. Alors,
thank you so much. Mr. Chair, as to my comments on this, I can tell you that yes, indeed, of course, when we consider the parts of this motion, there are a number of things that I find lacking here in this motion that we're seized of. To begin with, Mr. Chair, it is quite clear that with the appearance before us of Mr. Craig and Mark Kielberger on Monday last, they certainly did mention what they did in the summer of 2020, and they mentioned it then as well. They're having sent a message using LinkedIn to Mr. Ben Chin. And they stated, they testified indeed, sincerely, if I'm not mistaken, if my memory serves me well and my judgment is good, they said that this was the sole message that they sent to Mr. Chin. And that the message, as we heard last Monday, that the message had not been sent out directly by Mr. Kielberger, but indeed by one of his assistants, his direct assistant, if I'm executive assistant, if I'm correct, if I remember correctly from his testimony. And they said that this person had sent that out because it was a LinkedIn request that was sent, and Mr. Chin merely responded merely with a short phrase, a polite sort of response, the sort of thing that people often do in such circumstances. I myself, Mr. Chair, I had put this question, if I remember correctly. I had duly noted the fact that LinkedIn, I don't use it myself. A member of the opposition had said it's not very credible. People don't have LinkedIn accounts, and the conversation couldn't have been that simple. And I explained, and I do believe it's believable. I said here before the committee, and I said as much, and I found this can be found in the record of discussion here in this committee, that I myself do not keep a LinkedIn account, and it's totally understandable that this would have happened as it was explained, but there are a number of things that I find I take issue with here in this motion. When we say that we would like to receive from the Privy Council of the Liberal government, perhaps, Mr. Chair, perhaps I'm imagining things or looking at things too closely, actually. I mean, look, this is the government of Canada. The Privy Council isn't just some sort of politicized sideshow, a mechanism of some sort. As we know, we have our civil servants, professional civil servants, working there who work for any government, all governments, whatever political stripe that government might be of, whatever their political philosophy may be. Our civil servants are there to ensure that the common good of Canadians is always what is foremost and is always well served. So that is why I find this motion to be useless. And I indeed find it to be partisan in nature. And it's really it does not respect our function. And of course, Mr. Chair, you were a member of the prior government with Mr. Harper, and I know that you have had a very good political career, and I know that you will be able to see as well as I do that our civil servants have done exceptional work and nonpartisan work for the well-being of Canadians. So you are fully able to understand why I find this wording concerning, disorienting, this way of putting it, that this is a Privy Council of the Liberal government. It's basically of the Canadian government, of the government of Canada. But, Mr. Chair, I am happy to see that, at very least, the part that requested of Mr. Shugart that he appear before us, before the committee, has been replaced. As that showed little concern for his personal circumstances, and I would like to take this opportunity, I know that others have done this as well, to wish him good health. This is a gentleman who has had a long career as a servant, a civil servant, and when he was young, he was very involved even then and he has served a number of governments, successive governments of various political stripes.
I just remind you to move into to the relevance that portion of the text has been removed, and so I'd ask that you move to the amended motion, the motion as amended.
Super, super. Alors, Monsieur le Président.
Certainly, certainly. So, Mr. Chair, the fact that we'll now be waiting to receive this report, to be provided this report, is a very good change. Very good change made to the motion. However, this does leave us, Mr. Chair, with the remainder of the motion. And what remains, Mr. Chair, if if someone wished to speak ill of it, they would say that this is, kind of a fishing expedition, indeed, a witch hunt. Just because a witness, happened to mention specific names, certain names, that means that we must call these people here before us, before the committee. And of course, I'm referring to the fact, in this case, that last Monday, the Kilbrugger brothers mentioned in passing their situation with Mr. Chin and mentioned the names of Mr. Tice and Mr. Singh. But now we wished to compel their presence here before us at the committee. I remember, Mr. Chair, very well when one of your colleagues during sessions, sittings of the committee, I think it actually was this committee, the Ethics Committee, in the Harper era, worked very hard to block the appearance of political personnel before the committee. I do remember then an argument being presented.
Point of order.
Yes, we do have to leave to go to question periods. So are we going to wrap this meeting up and then we'll reconvene on Friday?
It's left to committee members to determine what it would look like. It appears as though Mr. Fergus was reminding me of the time that I was in government, and so I'm very familiar with what a filibuster looks like. And so this is looking very reminiscent of past times, and so it doesn't appear that we'll get to a vote. So I'll just maybe ask committee members, is there an appetite to move to a vote today? I'm seeing several people saying yes, and the three members on the speaking list saying no. So I think what we will do is I'm getting a sense by the question that there's an appetite to adjourn this committee meeting, and I guess return to this debate on Friday. Is that the sense I'm getting?
Yes.
I think so. Okay. We will move to adjourn then. Meeting adjourned.